Hi students, welcome to this first full lecture of the course. And this lecture we're going to be talking about the 14th century. So as we begin our study of the Renaissance and by extension the Reformation, it's important for us to understand the context in which these events took place. And so to that end, we turn to the events of the 14th century. This was a traumatic time, a chaotic time. Many things that people had previously taken for granted were challenged and were changed. And this opens the way in some respects for the transformation of the culture that's going to take place during the periods of the Renaissance and the Reformation. And so this is a period of change which will encourage people to question some aspects of their society that they'd probably previously taken for granted. And so we want to think a bit about the ways in which the Renaissance and by extension the Reformation are a response to these disasters and the ways in which they're not. It's very tempting to attribute everything that follows the 14th century to some of the disasters of the 14th century, like the Black Death. But it's important to maintain a critical attitude as historians. It's important to recognize not everything is attributable to these changes and to these events. We're going to move forward now. We're going to move forward into the 13th century. We're going to talk about medieval society in the 13th century. A society that in many ways was very successful, a society that in its culture displayed a broad confidence about the world in which it was set. So it's a society that's politically secure. We know that much of the history of the medieval period is a story of new people invading and settling in Europe. The Germanic tribes that invade during the period of the fall of the Roman Empire, Islamic invasions from the east and from the south, Viking invasions, Hungarian invasions, all these invasions have come to an end by the 13th century. In fact, it's been about 300 years since you've had serious political instability, the sort of political instability that's caused by a new group moving into the region. Of course, there have been civil wars and competitions within the inhabitants, but you haven't seen that kind of political challenge and that kind of political change for a number of centuries by this time. It's also a society, as you can see from this map here, that's economically connected and economically prosperous. So you can see that there are routes throughout Europe now that connect the different parts of Europe. With centers of trade outside Europe. We have a trading network to the north here in the Baltic Sea that's connected to England, but it's also connected to this corridor of trade, this very important corridor of trade along the Rhine River and into Germany. And these corridors of trade connect Northern Europe with the Mediterranean and with the very important merchant houses of Italy and also Barcelona. And then with the Byzantine Empire, with Islamic ruled areas in North Africa. So it's a wealthy society, it's an economically connected and prosperous society. It's also a united society. By this point, the vast majority of the population of Europe is made up of Catholic Christians. And most of these Catholic Christians, as far as we can tell, were genuine believers. There's a tendency when you look at more Marxist influenced historians to suggest that this is all sort of a system of control and oppression that no one's really believing. And no one really believes these truths. They're just kind of forced to by the systems of control that are present in this society. But we have more and more evidence now as we unpack and discover the evidence from ordinary people that this was not the case, that this was a society in which, again, most people really believed and really embraced these religious teachings. It's also an intellectually aspiring society. So in the late 11th century through the 12th and into the 13th century, we've had the development of the medieval university system, and this has been the result of growing societal confidence, People see that their lives are pretty secure, they're more prosperous than in previous generations. Everyone seems in agreement on important theological questions. This produces an attitude of confidence, among these people that they can really understand the world that they live in. And this gives rise to further study, the development of the medieval universities. What's interesting about the medieval universities is that these medieval universities, by and large, embody the confidence of this medieval society. And that's best encapsulated by the scholastic method, the method of acquiring new knowledge in this society. And this scholastic method, this school of scholastic thought that's very dominant in medieval universities, is based on the principle that human beings can understand the universe. The universe was made by an all-powerful, but also by an all-good God, and this God, in creating the universe, made it in a way that human beings with human reason could understand. And so this leads to, or this encourages a great deal of confidence among the people that live in this population. So much so that in medieval universities, we see efforts even to prove the existence of God through reason. This had been something that previously people had said, okay, there are things that you can know through reason. There are things that you have to rely on faith to know. The existence of God was one of these things. Can't prove that God exists. We can only know that God exists through belief. But that is being challenged in the medieval universities. Instead, the scholastic thinkers are arguing that we can use human reason and logic and make compelling arguments that God exists. So this gives you a sense of the confidence that was running through this society at this time. At the same time, there are challenges on the horizon for this society. So we've talked about the successes, the good things, the strengths of this society, but there are also challenges. One of these is economic stagnation. The population of Europe has been growing pretty consistently for really about 500 years at this point, but it's kind of reaching it's kind of reaching a high point or a full up point. The population of Europe at this stage is reaching heights that it will not reach again until the 18th and 19th centuries. And so this means the amount of resources that are available are becoming stretched more and more thinly. And so there haven't been any new technological developments that would make it possible for you to expand the food supply. And so huge amounts of land are under cultivation. As much land as is possible to cultivate is being cultivated. It's not really possible to cultivate anymore, and you're still kind of stretched to the limit in terms of providing for the people that you're caring for. So important to keep that in mind. And so at the same time as we've seen some economic successes here, we've also seen that this economy is starting to tighten, and that people in this latest generation are not doing quite so much better than the previous generation. There's also a challenge of climate change, and so we'll move on to this slide here. You can see that at this point we're starting to enter a period that's called the Little Ice Age. Temperature of Europe has been growing consistently for several centuries up until this point. And now that's going to drop off when we get to the 1300s. And the warming of the climate during this period was a central part of the economic success of medieval Europe. It meant that the yields from crops were higher. It meant more food was being produced. It meant there were greater surpluses. It meant the cost of food was lower, and that gave people the opportunity to afford other items and to be better off. And we know that as we come towards the end of the 13th century into the beginning of the 14th century, that people began to recognize that the climate was changing. We have accounts of people saying, look, we would normally go pasture our animals in the upper slopes of these mountains during the summer, but in recent years we haven't been able to do that because the snow isn't melting. We have people saying, look, we're seeing snow, that no one really remembers snow. We're seeing harbors and rivers freezing, and no one really remembers that. So we know that people at the time recognized that their climate was changing. And so this is going to be another challenge for this society. And so these are the periods of climate change. So let me just correct this for a second. This is population change. So you're going to see that we've seen consistent population growth up until the middle of the 14th century. Then there's a big decline, and it doesn't really pick up again for another couple of hundred years. And then this is basically aligned with the changes in climate that are going on at the time. We've had medieval warming period where the temperatures have been warmer and warmer. It's just starting to decline, and now we're going to enter this period of the Little Ice Age, where it becomes too cold, for example, for the Vikings to be inhabiting Greenland. The River Thames is freezing. That's what's shown at the bottom of this picture here. And so these are some of the challenges that people are facing. What caused this change in the climate? Of course, we don't really know. It's very difficult to assert with conviction what leads to changes in climate. One theory that's been proposed that I'm just going to give you before we move forward is that this climate change is caused by a series of massive volcanic eruptions that take place in the South Pacific during the 13th century. These are some of the volcanoes here. I think they're pretty cool images. The idea is that these massive eruptions project ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, and these block or reflect the sun's rays away from the Earth, and this contributes to a change in the temperatures across the globe. But we can't be sure that that's the reason, but that's just one of the arguments that's been proposed. However, these challenges come to a head with the Great Famine of 1315. And so summer of 1315 is exceptionally wet. It begins to rain. It continues to rain throughout the summer, and people try and bring in the crops to dry them out inside, but whatever they do, they can't seem to ripen the crops. And so you have an extremely bad harvest, and the price of bread triples. Many of the draft animals that people use to plow their fields have to starve to death. And this is going to lead to a decline in population as well, because the same thing happens the next summer. And now you're having to make really difficult decisions. Of the grain that you've been able to harvest, it's much less than normal. Do you eat it all because you need to in order to survive? Or do you have to save half of it so that you have something to plant the next season? If you eat it all, will you have nothing the following season? And so people are slaughtering the animals they use to plow the fields. People are dying of starvation. The fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, where the children are left in the woods by their parents who can no longer afford to feed them or are no longer able to feed them, that also dates from this period. In 1317, the weather returns to a normal pattern. So now you actually have a summer season where it's drier and warmer, but the climate is colder, and the climate doesn't return to the highs of previous years. And the thing is that you can't just stop economic production and then turn it back on again. And so you've killed a bunch of the animals, a bunch of people have died, you've depleted your seed reserves. You can't just plant seeds and grow crops at the same volume that you were before. And so it's going to take another 8 years for production to reach the same heights that it had before, or for people to be getting to a stage where people aren't dying of starvation and shortages of food each winter. So although the Great Famine only lasts for 2 years, the effects are felt for another 8 years. And even beyond that, people assert that from this point onwards, there's a decline in the public health of the European population. The diseases like tuberculosis that previously had been less significant become more prominent in the population. So there's a decline in overall public health. There's also a sense that the culture is becoming harsher, more severe, more individualistic. at this time as a result of this disaster. People feel insecure, they feel a greater need to look out for their own interests, and you see that reflected in maybe a more selfish, less generous population or less generous culture than had existed before.